Welcome back to day 3 of the pelvic floor challenge. So far, we've taken a look at how much length you have available to you in your calf muscles. We have evaluated the strength of your lateral hip muscles. And today, we're going to take a look at your hip flexors, which I briefly mentioned way back on day 1 when we were talking about why the calf stretch is relevant to your pelvic floor. So our hip flexors are a group of muscles that cross the front of the hip joint. And anytime our hip is in a flexed position, those muscles are in a shortened position. So if we spend a lot of time either with our knees slightly bent, which slightly bends our hips, those muscles are in a shortened position. Also, if we spend a lot of time sitting or driving, then these muscles are in a shortened position. And the reason why we want to address these muscles in relation to the pelvic floor is that, again, we come back to walking. When our hip flexors are short and tight, we have less ability for the leg to move into hip extension, which is this movement of the leg moving back behind the pelvis. So we have hip flexion and we have hip extension. So notice if you're able to stand here without any flexion in your hip or any tipping of your pelvis forward, is your pelvis able to be what we call neutral, which means that your front of your pelvis and your pubic bone are in the same vertical plane. They're stacked over each other, rather than your pubic symphysis being back behind you. So that's one thing. The next thing I want you to take a look at is if you place your hands on your pelvis, or you may even want to place a hand over the front of your pelvis, or hands here, so you have options, and then you take your leg back behind you. If you're standing on one leg and taking your leg back behind you, are you able to do that without tilting your pelvis? So ideally, we're keeping the pelvis, imagine there's concrete poured around your pelvis, and the only thing that can move is your leg at the hip joint. And you can also place your hands on your back and just notice, is your back moving as you do this? And if it is, can you keep your pelvis nice and still as you take your leg back behind you? Now, I'm not taking my leg back behind me by bending my knee, which can feel like, oh yeah, my foot's going way back there. We're keeping the leg straight, and we're isolating the movement just to the hip joint here, okay? How much hip extension do you have available to you when you really isolate the movement? Okay? Check your other side, because it will be different side to side. I like having my hands on my back so I can tell when my pelvis starts to get involved. So notice. You can have one hand on your back, one hand across your pelvis. And again, you're just really isolating the movement to the hip. If you're having a really hard time moving your leg without moving your pelvis, chances are you've got some tension in your hip flexors. And you can also get a sense of this based on your lifestyle. Do you spend a fair bit of time sitting? Do you spend, when you evaluate the position of your pelvis, is it tilted forward? Which does not mean, and I really want to emphasize this, it does not mean that you then clench your glutes to straighten that out, okay? We're not adding tension to a tension problem by battling it with more tension. If your pelvis is tilted forward, that means your hip flexor tension needs to be addressed. It doesn't mean you need to work harder with your glutes to power through that tension, all right? Now we're going to take a look at a couple stretches that you can do to help open your hip flexors and lengthen your hip flexors. However, these stretches, while beneficial, will not undo the effects of spending hours in this position. So, not only do you need to do the corrective exercise, but we also need to change the lifestyle habit that is creating the hip flexor tension in the first place, which for most of us is extended periods of time spent sitting. So start looking at how can you decrease the quantity of time that you spend sitting, and how can you break up your sitting so that you're not sitting for hours on end, but you're breaking up the time spent sitting with standing and adding movement variety throughout your day, all right? So stretches are great, but they're not gonna be a magical cure for spending 6, 7, 8, 10 hours in this position by 5 minutes of stretching your hip flexors, all right? Sorry to break that to you, but I'm sure you can understand. So I'm gonna show two things. One is gonna be a stretch where you're lying on your back. The other is going to be a stretch, a lunge. So if your knees are problematic, you'll probably be better off with the lying down version. If you're pregnant, the lying down version, depending on how far along you are in your pregnancy, is probably not going to be comfortable for you, and you'll want to do the lunge version. All right, so I'm going to show the lunge version first. I like having something underneath my knees because my kneecaps got beat up from years of dance, so having a little cushion underneath them is helpful at this point. So you're going to step forward with one foot. You can use a wall or a chair if you need some extra stability. And the first thing I'm going to have you check is, without moving forward into the lunge, with just stacking your pelvis over your knee, are you able to have a flat front of your hip, or is it slightly bent? So I just want you to notice. And for a lot of people, believe it or not, just being in a non-bent position or a non-flexed position is going to be a bit of a stretch. So this is your hip flexor stretch if this is what you're noticing. Now, if you're able to maintain an unflexed hip, then I'm going to have you progress to the next step, which is to shift forward with your pelvis while leaving your knee behind. So go ahead and shift forward. Now, you may be here thinking, what's the big deal, Lisa? I can go this far. Yes, I can too, but I'm going to have you fine-tune it a little bit. So come back to your pelvis stacked over your knee. And what I want you to do now is, if this is your pelvis, I want you to only move your pelvis forward as far as you can without allowing your pelvis to tilt forward. So if your pelvis were a bowl filled with soup, we don't want to spill any soup out the front of the bowl. All right? So you're keeping your bowl nice and steady as you shift forward. If you're going this far, notice how my bowl is tipping forward, all right? Which means I'm no longer isolating the stretch to the hip joint, which is what I really want to focus on. So it's there's much less to look at. It doesn't look nearly as great as woohoo, but it's really honing in on and evaluating how much length do you have available to you in your hip flexor. So you might be surprised, and probably not pleasantly surprised, to see what you have available to you or how little you have available to you. And we'll do the other side. And remember, each side again is going to have its own story. So we've got the pelvis stacked over the knee as our starting point. If you have the length to be able to move forward from here, we'll do so. If not, that's fine. Just stay where you are and let this be your stretch for now. And then we'll shift the pelvis forward without tipping the bowl of soup in the process. also, actually I'm going to add this when we come back so I don't overload you. I'll add another piece in when we come to the second, to do a repeat. So we'll come back to the first side. And on this next pass, I'm going to have you keep track of your pelvic bowl, that you're not spilling your soup. I also want you to keep track that your ribs are stacked over your pelvis instead of lifting up as you move forward. Because lifting the ribs up changes the length of some of these muscles through here that is a way of bypassing the tension. So I'm not going to get into all the nitty-gritty of why that is, but just know that when you lift your ribs up, your chest up, that's a way that we bypass tension in muscles that cross the front of the hip. So we're taking the pelvis forward, keeping the ribs stacked over the pelvis, not lifting the chest up and the ribs up. And we'll do the other side. And again, we're keeping the pelvis stacked over the knee and then shifting the bowl of the pelvis forward as we leave the knee anchored on the bolster. If you don't have a bolster, you can use a towel, a rolled up yoga mat. All right, so there you have one version of stretching the hip flexors. Now I'm going to show you a lying down version. And you'll want something, a stack of cushions, a yoga block with a towel over it can work so that there's a little bit of padding. Yoga bolster is great. Couch cushions can work. Just something that you can put under your pelvis to elevate it. Pillows don't work as well because they're so squishy, but if you have firm pillows or a nice blanket that you can roll up or fold up so that it's stacked, or a stack of blankets. So we're going to lie on our back with the pelvis elevated. And then from this position, I'm going to have you bring both knees into the chest. So we're allowing the low back to round. Essentially, we're tucking the pelvis under. And then I'm going to have you anchor your left knee into your chest. So the left knee doesn't move. We don't want it going along for the ride. Then we're going to take the right leg up to the ceiling, straightening the knee. And then we're going to gently lower the right leg down towards the floor. But again, we're keeping that left knee hugged in, and we're keeping the pelvis anchored. So what I don't want you to do is this. I don't want the low back to arch. I don't want the pelvis to move. I want all of the pelvis to stay nice and anchored and only the leg to move. So we're taking the leg, keeping the knee straight, and allowing it to drift down towards the floor. And in the process of doing that, we're asking those hip flexor muscles to lengthen. And your job here is to hang out and breathe. And allow the hip flexors to relax, and the leg will slowly lower down closer to the floor. And then we'll bend the knee, bringing the right knee into the chest, anchoring that right knee, taking the left foot up, straightening the left knee, and lowering that left leg down to the floor, keeping the right knee hugged into the chest to stabilize the pelvis. And notice what this second side is like compared to the first. As you're Gently giving these hip flexors on this left side an opportunity to lengthen. All right, we'll bring both knees in. You can bring the feet down to the floor, lift the pelvis up to push your bolster out and come up. So there you have two options for inviting a little more length into your hip flexors. Keeping in mind, however, that stretching 5 minutes a day isn't going to magically undo hours of sitting a day. So also think about ways you can reduce your sitting time so that you are decreasing the amount of time that you are shortening your hip flexors. All right, enjoy this. Keep in mind also that the reason why your hip flexor length is relevant to your pelvic floor is because, again, we're looking at how much can your leg move back behind your pelvis with every step you take when you are walking, which hopefully you are getting in walking time during your day, throughout your day, because it does have huge benefits for your pelvic floor. And in the process of doing the walking, as the leg moves back into hip extension, we're engaging hamstrings and glutes, which helps to stabilize the pelvis and maintain the length of the pelvic floor so that the muscles of the pelvic floor have the right amount of force generation. All right, we need the muscles of the pelvic floor to be at the right length, not too long, not too short, to be able to do their job and generate the force in response to the variety of activities that we are doing, whether that is the activity of standing or walking or running or sneezing, and all of a sudden we need then those muscles to really kick on, or whatever else we do throughout our day. Our pelvic floor is always working to a greater or lesser extent. So add in some of these hip flexor stretches, decrease your time spent sitting so that you can reap more benefits of your glutes and help your pelvic floor. Enjoy.